What a great quotation. Absolute genius, insight, and essential wisdom for those of us who want to think like futurists, elevate our strategic thinking, see the world differently. But when I came across this quote, I didn't know who Grace Hopper was. If you know anything about me, you'll know that I love a good story. And Grace Hopper is one of the very best. Grace was born in 1906, and she went on by the early 1930s to, unexpectedly, a woman 100 years ago. At Vassar University, she completed a degree in mathematics and physics, went on to do her master's, then was offered a teaching position, finished her PhD, and ended up by 1934 was a full professor in mathematics and physics at Vassar University. World War II came along, and when Pearl Harbor happened, she volunteered into the Navy. She did a crash course in the Navy volunteers, moved into the Navy environment, and because of her ability with maths, got involved in some of the code breaking and some of the work that was being done in the early, today we would call it computerization, but back then they weren't even thinking of it as computers, just advanced machines that they were using, gathering information, trying to code break and so on. She did very well and was hugely successful in that, credited with many breakthroughs during the war. After the war, she decided she really liked the Navy and she'd love to stay on, so she asked if she could be commissioned into the Navy and was told at age 40 she was too old and that this wasn't going to be available. She was very disappointed, so she stayed on as a reservist, which she stayed on for quite a long time. We'll get to that part of the story in a second. But she decided not to go back to university, so she joined a company that ended up being the company that made UNIVAC. Now, if you know anything about computing history, UNIVAC was, well, let me show you what UNIVAC was. It was the world's first computer as we know it today. And there is old Grace, looking like she's already in her 80s, but don't judge her. It was the 1950s, and that was a look back then. She was smart as anything because she was the person who wrote the manual for what became IBM computers later, the Mark I, the Mark II, the Mark III. She got involved in UNIVAC, making sure UNIVAC worked, created the first compiler program, and then she also believed that it would be possible to write computer code in English, making it more accessible to people. At this point, you had to write it in whatever special code the computer was working. People told her it wouldn't work, but she made it work, and she's credited, those again of you who know your computer history, she's credited as the significant force in the team that eventually wrote COBOL. Not bad, right? Anyway, in 1966, she was asked to retire from the Navy. She had been a reservist, she had been helping the Navy to develop their computing capabilities, just volunteering, right, as a reservist. In 1966, she was asked to retire from that. In her memoirs, she calls it the saddest day of her life. She really did love the military. Anyway, a few months later, the military came to her and offered her a full-time position this time, of saying, actually, we want you, we realize what we're now missing. Ridiculous thing to ask you to retire. So they invited her now for the first time to come in full-time. So she's now in, I think she was 72 at the time. No, sorry, she was 60, in her 60s at the time. Comes back into the Navy, helps them to develop their computing. Finally, at the age of 77, I think it was, is asked to retire from the Navy, and then gets offered a job at Digital Equipment Company, DEC, one of the first companies that was working on big mainframes. They were a massive company, sixth biggest computing company in the world at the time. Their biggest mistake was to miss out on desktop computing, by the way. That's why we don't know about them now. But they were a huge company at the time, and she worked with them until at the age of 82, sadly, she passed away. What a story. One of the pioneers of computer programming, giving us the software that ran the mainframe computers that gave us computing in the world as we know it today. And that, then, is Grace Hopper. When she was ultimately retired at age 77 from the military, she was the oldest serving commander of the military, and I think still holds that record. So when Grace Hopper tells you that the most damaging phrase in the English language is, "It's always been done that way," well, maybe, just maybe, we should listen. Thanks, Grace.